Millionaire mocks poor girl who claimed to speak 9 languages until she left him speechless. In front of everyone, he laughed when the janitor's daughter said she understood the contract in various languages, called it a joke, a poor person's fantasy. But she took the paper, read it, translated it, and pointed out errors no one else saw. In the end, she saved millions, and all he could do was lower his head. If this story interested you, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and tell us what city you're watching from. Let's continue. I promise this will be the best story you'll ever hear in your life. The heavy silence of the 42nd floor of the Meridian Business Tower was broken only by the discreet hum of the air conditioning and the nervous drumming of Richard Morrison's fingers on the mahogany table. At 52, the real estate magnate had built an empire based on quick decisions and a keen instinct for business. But at that moment, faced with a 300-page document filled with legal terms in multiple languages, he felt completely lost. The negotiation that would define the next 10 years of his company was literally slipping through his fingers. The international consortium had sent a contract so complex that not even the 3 certified translators, hired in a hurry, could completely decipher it. Archaic Latin expressions mixed with technical terminology in German, clauses in legal French, and subclauses in 18th century corporate English. Richard watched his most trusted executives pore over stacks of papers, specialized dictionaries, and laptops with translation software, all with the same expression of poorly disguised desperation. The deadline for a response was 6 o'clock that day, and it was already past 3:30. With each passing minute, millions of dollars in business potential evaporated like morning mist. On the other side of the panoramic room, near the enormous windows that offered a spectacular view of the city, Connie Sanders discreetly passed, a moistened cloth over the Italian design furniture. At 41, she had worked as a cleaning assistant at Meridian Tower for more than a decade, always invisible to the eyes of the powerful who frequented those floors. Her impeccable navy blue uniform and silent movements made her part of the landscape, like the paintings on the walls or the ornamental plants strategically positioned. Beside her, sitting in a discreet chair in the corner of the room, was her daughter Isabella, 13 years old. The girl had been forced to accompany her mother that day because her school was under renovation and there were no classes. With her brown hair tied in a simple ponytail and wearing a cotton dress that Connie had sewn by hand, Isabella dramatically contrasted with the luxurious environment around her. While the executives discussed in increasingly altered tones, Isabella kept her eyes fixed on a worn notebook she always carried with her. Its yellowed pages contained notes in various languages, drawings of linguistic symbols, and small translation exercises she did as a hobby. The girl had an inexplicable passion for languages and spent hours at the municipal library studying old dictionaries and forgotten grammars. Richard slammed his fist on the table with such force that it made the crystal glasses vibrate. Everyone in the room jumped except Connie, who continued her work as if nothing had happened, and Isabella, who merely raised her eyes briefly before returning to her notes. "This is unacceptable," exploded Richard, his voice echoing through the room. "How is it possible that a company of our size can't decipher a simple contract? You are supposedly the best professionals in the market." Dr. Augustus Parker, the company's chief lawyer, nervously adjusted his glasses. "Mr. Morrison, this is not a common document. The terms have been deliberately obscured. It's almost as if it was written to be incomprehensible." "Almost as if." Richard stood up abruptly, his imposing figure dominating the room. "Either it is or it isn't. We need certainties, not assumptions." Mary Fernandez, the Director of International Relations, tried to ease the situation. "Sir, we've already contacted 3 different universities. The linguistics professors are analyzing the document, but nothing," Richard interrupted her. "We have 2.5 hours to give a definitive answer. If we lose this opportunity, it will be you who explains to the shareholders why we wasted the greatest chance for expansion in this company's history." The atmosphere in the room became even more tense. Some executives exchanged worried glances, while others pretended to be deeply concentrated on their papers to avoid drawing the attention of the furious boss. The sound of phones ringing, incessantly on the floor below, came as a constant reminder that the business world wasn't stopping to wait for them. Connie, who had witnessed countless tense meetings over the years, recognized the signs of a corporate crisis in progress. She knew that when Richard began pacing the room like a caged lion, it usually meant something very important was at stake. Discreetly, she approached the area where her daughter was, preparing to leave the room if necessary. Isabella, however, seemed strangely fascinated by the situation. Her bright eyes followed every movement of the executives, every word exchanged between them. Occasionally, she made small notes in her notebook, as if cataloguing the technical vocabulary she heard. That's when something unexpected happened. During a pause in the heated discussion, when everyone seemed momentarily defeated by the complexity of the document, Isabella discreetly raised her hand. The gesture was so subtle that only her mother initially noticed. Connie immediately approached her daughter and whispered, "Izzy, honey, this is not the time to ask questions. Let's leave the room." But Isabella, with the determination that only children possess, shook her head negatively. "Mum, I think I can help." The words were spoken quietly, but the momentary silence in the room caused some executives to hear them. Dr. Parker was the first to turn in the girl's direction, followed by Mary Fernandez and other team members. Richard, who had his back turned watching the city through the window, turned slowly. His eyes narrowed as he focused on the small, out-of-place figure of the girl in the corner of the room. For a moment, he seemed not to completely understand what he had heard. "Excuse me," he said, his voice carrying a mixture of incredulity and growing irritation. "Did you say something?" Connie felt the blood freeze in her veins. She knew that tone of voice. It was the same one Richard used when he was about to publicly humiliate an employee who had made a serious mistake. Instinctively, she positioned herself slightly in front of her daughter in a protective gesture. "Mr. Morrison," Connie said quickly, "I apologize. My daughter didn't mean to disturb. We're leaving now." But Richard raised his hand, interrupting her. His eyes remained fixed on Isabella, and a sardonic smile began to form on his lips. It was the kind of smile that didn't reach his eyes, the kind that preceded cutting comments he used to crush people he considered inferior. "No," he said, his voice taking on a dangerously sweet tone. "I would very much like to hear what this young expert has to say about our situation." The silence that followed Richard's words was as sharp as a blade. Everyone in the room seemed to have stopped breathing, waiting for what would come next. Connie felt her legs trembling, recognizing the dangerous tone in her boss's voice. She had witnessed other situations where he had verbally destroyed employees for much less. Isabella, however, remained calm. Her clear eyes met Richard's without showing fear or intimidation. It was as if she didn't completely understand the power dynamic that was at play in that room, or simply chose to ignore it. "I just wanted to say that maybe I can understand some parts of the document," she said, her young voice sounding strangely mature. "I've been studying languages for a long time." The reaction was immediate. Richard let out a loud and sarcastic laugh that echoed through the glass room. Some executives exchanged uncomfortable glances, but none dared to intervene. They knew their boss's explosive temperament too well to risk it. "Studying languages?" Richard repeated, still laughing. "Where exactly? At the neighborhood public school?" He slowly approached the girl like a predator circling its prey. "Do you have any idea what's happening here, dear?" Connie stepped forward, trying to interpose herself between her boss and her daughter. "Mr. Morrison, please. She's just a child. She didn't mean to—" "Silence!" Richard cut her off sharply without taking his eyes off Isabella. "Let the young linguist speak. After all, perhaps she has the solution that our dear international law doctors couldn't find." Dr. Parker uncomfortably cleared his throat. "Sir, perhaps it would be better—" "Better what?" Richard turned to him with renewed anger. "Continue wasting time with incompetent translators while millions slip through our fingers. Or perhaps we should listen to the wisdom of a 13-year-old girl." The sarcasm in his voice was so thick it seemed tangible. Some executives lowered, their eyes clearly uncomfortable with the situation, but none had enough courage to confront Richard when he was in that state. Mary Fernandez tried a diplomatic approach. "Mr. Morrison, why don't we focus on the document? We still have time to—" "Time for what?" Richard interrupted her again. "To continue pretending we know what we're doing." He gestured dramatically in Isabella's direction. "Or perhaps we should let our young prodigy here guide us through the mysteries of international legislation." The humiliation was just beginning. Richard seemed to have found an outlet for his frustration and didn't intend to waste the opportunity. He walked to his desk and picked up one of the pages of the contract, waving it in the air as if it were a trophy. "Do you know what this is, dear?" he asked, addressing Isabella again. "It's a contract worth $800 million. $800 million. Do you have any notion of what that number means?" Isabella remained silent, but her eyes attentively followed each of Richard's movements. There were no tears, no tremor in her voice, just a disconcerting serenity that seemed to irritate the businessman even more. "This document," Richard continued, his voice rising, "was drafted by some of Europe's most brilliant legal minds. People with decades of experience, doctorates, from the world's best universities, who spent years studying international law." He made a dramatic pause. "And you, a girl who probably doesn't even have a passport, believe you can understand something they created?" Connie felt tears beginning to prick her eyes. She knew her daughter well enough to know that Isabella wouldn't make a frivolous claim. The girl really had an extraordinary gift for languages, spent hours studying old dictionaries, and had surprised even her teachers with her ability to decipher complex texts. But how to explain this to a man who had already decided they were merely obstacles in his way? "And furthermore," Richard continued, clearly warmed up in his performance, "this isn't just any contract. It's a document that will determine whether this company continues to exist for the next 10 years or whether we go bankrupt due to incompetence. Do you understand the responsibility involved?" Some executives began to shift uncomfortably in their chairs. The situation was clearly getting out of control, but none of them knew how to intervene without becoming the next target of Richard's fury. Dr. Parker made another attempt. "Sir, time is passing. Perhaps it would be better if we concentrated." "Our efforts on—" "Concentrate where?" Richard exploded. "You've already tried everything, translators, software, university professors. Nothing worked." He pointed dramatically at Isabella. "So why not? Why not let a child show us how it's done?" The tone of his voice had become completely sarcastic, each word pronounced as if it were a cruel joke. It was evident to everyone in the room that he had no real intention of letting Isabella see the document. The entire situation was just an elaborate form of public humiliation. "Come here, dear," Richard said, making an exaggerated gesture with his hands. "Come show us how a girl can solve what adults can't." Connie couldn't take it anymore. "Please, sir," she said, her voice choked with emotion. "She's just a child. You don't need to do this to her." "Do what?" Richard feigned innocence. "I'm just offering a unique opportunity for your daughter to demonstrate her extraordinary talents. Isn't that what every mother wants? To see her child shine?" The cruelty in his words was unmistakable. He was clearly enjoying the situation, savoring each moment of discomfort he caused. It was the kind of behavior that had made Richard a feared figure in the business world, but also deeply disrespected by those who truly knew him. That's when something unexpected happened. Isabella calmly rose from her chair, closed her worn notebook, and looked directly at Richard. There was no defiance in her eyes nor fear, only a serene determination that caught everyone by surprise. "I would like to see the document, please," she said, her voice clear and firm. The request was so simple, so direct, that for a moment no one knew how to react. Richard blinked, clearly not expecting her to take his provocation seriously. Some executives looked at each other, confused about how to proceed. "You... what?" Richard stammered, momentarily losing his train of thought. "The document, Isabella," repeated patiently. "You offered to let me try to help. I would like to try." The room fell into absolute silence. The only audible sound was the hum of the air conditioning and the distant noise of traffic down below. Everyone seemed to be processing what had just happened. Richard looked around the room, as if expecting someone to intervene, for someone to end this farce before it went too far. but he found only expectant looks. His own executives, after hours of failure, seemed genuinely curious to see what would happen next. He was cornered by his own arrogance. After so much scorn, after turning the situation into a public spectacle of humiliation, he couldn't simply back down without appearing even more ridiculous than he already did. With gritted teeth and a forced smile that fooled no one, Richard slowly extended one of the pages of the contract toward Isabella. Isabella received the page with both hands, holding it with the same care she would dedicate to an ancient manuscript. Her eyes quickly scanned the dense lines of text, and to everyone's surprise, her expression showed neither confusion nor intimidation. On the contrary, there was a serene concentration on her face, as if she were reading something perfectly familiar. Richard remained standing beside her, arms crossed, a sardonic smile on his lips. He expected her to quickly surrender, admit her inability, and end this embarrassing theater. Some of the executives discreetly checked their watches, remembering the deadline that was inexorably approaching. After a few minutes of silence, Isabella looked up. "May I see the other pages related to this section?" she asked calmly. Dr. Parker, who had been watching the situation with increasing discomfort, hesitated. He looked at Richard, waiting for instruction, but the businessman merely made an impatient gesture with his hand as if saying, "Let her hang herself with her own rope." Isabella received 4 more pages and carefully spread them out on a side table. She began to make small notes in her notebook, drawing connecting lines between different passages, as if assembling a complex puzzle. "Interesting," she murmured to herself. They used a cross-reference structure based on the Napoleonic civil code, but adapted to the modern German legal system. The words came out so naturally that for a moment no one fully processed what she had said. Then Dr. Parker approached, frowning. "What do you mean?" he asked, his voice showing genuine curiosity for the first time that afternoon. "This clause here," Isabella pointed to a paragraph in the middle of the second page, "it references an article that isn't in this document, but in an appendix that should have been sent separately. Without that appendix, the entire interpretation of the section is compromised." Mary Fernandez approached as well, momentarily forgetting the tension that had dominated the room. "Appendix? What appendix?" "You received only the main document," Isabella explained patiently. "But based on the numbering of the clauses and the structure of the references, there should be at least 3 complementary appendices. This text you're trying to decipher is just the central part of a much larger set." A heavy silence fell over the room. All eyes turned to Richard, who had visibly paled. He quickly went to his computer and began frantically checking his email inbox. "There's more," Isabella continued, apparently oblivious to the commotion she had caused. "This section about financial auditing is written in archaic legal Latin, mixed with modern German terminology. The literal translation you made is incorrect. Where you read implementation period of 15 business days, it should actually be interpreted as maximum response period of 15 calendar days, including weekends and holidays." Dr. Parker dropped the pen he was holding. "That means that you have much less time than you thought," Isabella confirmed serenely. "If my calculations are correct, the actual deadline expires today at 6 in the evening, not next Monday, as you interpreted." Richard, who had been furiously typing on his computer, turned abruptly. "Impossible," he said, but his voice no longer carried the arrogant confidence of before. "You're making all this up." Isabella looked at him with that same disconcerting serenity. "I can show you exactly where it's written if you'd like." Without waiting for a response, she went to the main page and pointed to a specific line. "Here, where it says dies naturalis quindes impost acceptationem, the correct translation would be 15 natural days after acceptance, not 15 business days for implementation. The difference may seem subtle, but legally it's fundamental." Mary. Fernandez approached and examined the text indicated by Isabella. Her eyes gradually widened as she processed the explanation. "My God," she whispered, "she's right." "And there are more problems," Isabella continued, turning to another section of the document. This clause here about intellectual property contains a very well-disguised trap. It seems to grant the other party only limited commercial usage rights, but in reality, due to the way it was written, it transfers complete ownership of any technology developed during the partnership. This time it was Richard who approached, practically snatching the paper from Isabella's hands. His eyes frantically scanned the text while she patiently explained each linguistic nuance she had identified. See how the preposition come was used here instead of pro, she pointed out. In the Roman legal context, this completely changes the meaning of the transfer of rights. Instead of on behalf of, it becomes together with, implying shared possession, which, under modern German law, automatically converts to full ownership after a period of use. Dr. Parker was visibly shaken. How can a 13-year-old girl know all this? For the first time, Isabella smiled shyly. I spend a lot of time at the public library. They have a section of old books that almost nobody visits. I like to read about how languages evolve and influence each other throughout history. Connie, who had watched everything in silence, felt a mixture of pride and terror. Pride at seeing her daughter demonstrate talents she always knew existed, but terror at the reaction this might provoke in Richard. "This is ridiculous," Richard muttered, but his voice no longer carried conviction. "You're all being fooled by a child who read some old books." "Then test me," Isabella said calmly. "Give me any page of the document and I can show you the problematic points." The challenge hung in the air like a provocation. Richard looked around the room seeking support, but found only expectant faces. His own executives, after hours of failure, were clearly intrigued by Isabella's discoveries. Reluctantly, he chose one of the most complex pages of the contract and handed it to her. Isabella examined it for a few minutes, making occasional notes in her notebook before beginning to speak. "This section deals with financial auditing," she began. "But there's a serious translation problem here. Where you interpreted that the audit would be conducted by qualified representatives of both parties, the original German text specifies that it must be durch unabhängige von beiden Seiten, anerkannte Prüfer, which means by independent auditors recognized by both parties. The difference is crucial because it means they can bring their own auditors," Mary Fernandez completed, immediately understanding the implications. "And we would have to accept them." "Exactly," Isabella confirmed. "But there's a way out. If you look 3 paragraphs below, there's a reciprocity clause that allows either party to request external auditors certified by a neutral international organization. You can use that to balance the process." The silence that followed was different from the previous ones. It was no longer a silence of discomfort or embarrassment, but of intense concentration. Everyone in the room was beginning to realize that perhaps, just perhaps, this girl really possessed the skills she claimed to have. Richard, however, was not willing to accept the situation easily. His authority, his reputation as an infallible man in business was being questioned by a child, the daughter of a janitor. It was unacceptable. "Enough," he said brusquely, extending his hand to retrieve the documents. "We're not going to base an $800 million decision on a girl's fantasies." But Dr. Parker interfered for the first time that afternoon, placing his own hand over the papers. "Mr. Morrison," he said carefully, "perhaps we should verify this information. If she's right about the deadline, we don't have time to call more consultants." "If she's right," Richard exploded, "have you completely lost your minds?" It was then that the phone on Richard's desk rang. He answered with irritation, but his expression quickly changed as he listened to the voice on the other end of the line. When he hung up, his face was livid. "That was the German consortium," he said slowly. "They want to know if we received the complementary appendices to the contract. Apparently there was a technical problem and the additional documents weren't sent." All eyes turned to Isabella, who remained calmly seated, as if she had expected that confirmation all along. The confirmation from the phone call fell on the room like lightning on a clear sky. Richard remained motionless for long seconds, the phone still in his hand, slowly processing what it meant. A 13-year-old girl whom he had publicly humiliated just an hour before had precisely identified an error that would cost the company hundreds of millions of dollars. Dr. Parker, was the first to react. "We need the appendices immediately," he said, addressing Richard. "If the real deadline is at 6 o'clock, we have less than an hour." Richard nodded mechanically and dialed his assistant. "Mark, I need you to contact the German consortium right now. Request the urgent sending of the complementary appendices to the contract. Yes, now. I don't care what time it is in Germany." Meanwhile, Isabella had continued her silent analysis of the main document. Her notes in the worn notebook had multiplied, forming a complex network of connections between different sections of the contract. "There are more things you need to know," she said softly, interrupting the frantic instructions Richard was giving. On the phone. Everyone turned to her again. The air of skepticism that had dominated the room had completely evaporated. Now there was a respectful, almost reverent attention directed at that girl who continued to surprise with each observation. "The section on technology transfer contains what appears to be an impossible requirement," Isabella began, pointing to a dense paragraph on page 6. "They request complete access to the prototypes and technical specifications of all products developed in the last 5 years. Mary Fernandez sighed deeply. "That's unacceptable. That information is the heart of our competitive advantage." "But," Isabella continued with a slight smile, "there's a reciprocity clause 3 pages ahead that you can use. If you look here," she turned to page 9, "there's a provision that allows any transfer of technical information to be conditioned on receiving equivalent data from the other party." Dr. Parker examined the indicated text, his eyes shining with growing understanding. "That means that they would have to share their own technical specifications," Isabella completed. "And based on the structure of the agreement, they probably didn't expect you to discover this clause." Richard, who had finished his urgent calls, slowly approached. His expression had changed dramatically. The arrogance and sarcasm had disappeared, replaced by something that rarely appeared on his face: genuine humility. "How can you see these connections?" he asked, his voice devoid of the previous aggression. Isabella shrugged timidly. "It's like putting together a puzzle. Each language has its own rules and traditions. When you mix several languages in a legal document, you create layers of meaning. That can be interpreted in different ways, depending on which linguistic tradition you prioritize." Connie observed the transformation taking place in the room with a mixture of admiration and apprehension. She saw her daughter being treated with a respect she had never experienced in that environment, but also feared that it would be only temporary, that they would soon return to their usual invisibility. The appendices arrived by email 15 minutes later. Isabella examined them quickly, confirming her suspicions about the general structure of the agreement. With the complete documents, she was able to identify even more inconsistencies and strategic opportunities. "Here's something interesting," she said, indicating a section of the second appendix. "There's a clause that allows modifications to the initial agreement, but only if requested before the final ratification. You still have that opportunity." "What kind of modifications?" Mary Fernandez asked, leaning over the documents. "Well," Isabella consulted her notes, "you could propose that the financial audit be conducted by a neutral international organization instead of allowing each party to choose their own auditors. That would eliminate conflicts of interest." Dr. Parker nodded vigorously. "That would protect our interests and still seem like a reasonable proposal to them." "And more," Isabella continued, "you can request that any technology transfer be scaled over 3 years instead of being immediate. The clause allows for this, but it's hidden in the technical terminology of the third appendix." Richard listened to each suggestion with growing attention. Slowly, a complete strategy was forming, based on Isabella's discoveries. A strategy that would not only save the agreement, but potentially transform it into something much more advantageous for his company. With 30 minutes remaining before the deadline, the team worked feverishly to formulate a response that incorporated all of Isabella's suggestions. She remained by their side throughout the process, clarifying linguistic nuances and helping to refine the wording to maximize their strategic advantages. At 5:45 in the afternoon, the response was sent. 15 minutes later, confirmation arrived. The German consortium had accepted all the proposed modifications. More than that, they expressed admiration for the legal sophistication of the analysis and suggested an in-person meeting to discuss future collaborations. The silence that followed the confirmation was different from all the previous ones. It was a silence of relief, of admiration, and, mainly, of recognition. Everyone in the room understood that they had witnessed something extraordinary. Richard was the first to break the silence. He approached Isabella, who had returned to sitting discreetly in her chair in the corner of the room, and knelt beside her, placing himself at the same level as the girl. "Isabella," he said, his voice filled with emotion, "I need to apologize. What I did to you today was unforgivable. I judged you by your appearance, your age, your background, and nearly cost my company a fortune because of my prejudice." The girl looked at him with those same serene eyes as before. "It's okay, Mr. Morrison. People sometimes have difficulty seeing beyond appearances." The simplicity and wisdom contained in that response deeply touched everyone present. Connie felt tears of pride silently streaming down her face. Richard stood up and addressed the center of the room. "I want all of you to be witnesses to what I'm going to say now," he solemnly declared. "Isabella Sanders saved this company today. Not only did she identify errors that could have cost us hundreds of millions, but she transformed a mediocre agreement into an extraordinary strategic partnership." He turned to Connie. "Mrs. Sanders, you've worked here for more than 10 years. You've always been an exemplary employee, but never received the recognition you deserve. Starting Monday, you will be promoted to the position of facilities supervisor, with the corresponding salary and all the benefits." Connie covered her mouth with her hands, hardly believing what she was hearing. It was a promotion she had dreamed of for years, but that always seemed out of reach. "And as for you, Isabella," Richard continued, "I want to offer a full scholarship at the best bilingual school in the city. Additionally, when you turn 18, there will be a position waiting for you in our International Relations Department, if that interests you." The generosity of the offer was impressive, but Isabella responded with the same serenity as always. "I would like that very much, Mr. Morrison. Thank you." Dr. Parker approached and extended his hand to Isabella. "It was an honor to work with you today. I hope we can collaborate again in the future." One by one, all the executives present approached to congratulate Isabella and express their admiration. The girl who had been ridiculed at the beginning of the afternoon was now being treated as a hero. When the room finally emptied, leaving only Richard, Connie, and Isabella, the businessman went to the panoramic window and contemplated the illuminated city below. "You know, Isabella," he said thoughtfully, "today I learned a lesson that's worth more than all the business deals in the world. I learned that true intelligence has no age, no social origin, no specific appearance. It can be anywhere, just waiting for an opportunity to manifest itself." He turned to her with a sincere smile. "Thank you for teaching me that, and thank you for saving my company, despite how I treated you." Isabella closed her worn notebook and stood up. "People deserve second chances, Mr. Morrison. All people." As mother and daughter walked through the empty corridors of Meridian Tower, Connie firmly held Isabella's hand. "I'm so proud of you," she whispered. "Not just for what you did today, but for how you did it. With dignity, with forgiveness, with wisdom." Isabella smiled. "Mum, you always taught me that knowledge only has value when it's used to help people. Today I was able to help many people, including Mr. Morrison." The next morning, news of the successful negotiation spread quickly through the business world, but along with it spread also the story of how a 13-year-old girl had saved an $800 million deal. The story became legendary, cited in business schools and law colleges as an example of how talent can emerge in the most unexpected places. Richard never again underestimated anyone based on appearances. The company implemented a talent identification program among all employees, regardless of position or function. And Isabella, who continued to visit the public library on weekends, became a symbol that the true wealth of a society lies not only in its financial resources, but in the human potential that often remains hidden, waiting only for an opportunity to shine. Years later, when Isabella graduated with honors in international law and became one of the most respected lawyers in the country, she always remembered that day at Meridian Tower. Not as the day she was humiliated, but as the day she learned that even the hardest hearts can be transformed when confronted with truth and genuine kindness. And on her desk, next to diplomas and certificates, she always kept that worn notebook she carried on that memorable afternoon, reminding herself that true wisdom comes not from the titles we possess, but from the humility with which we use our gifts to make a difference in people's lives. The end of the story. Dear listeners, we hope that the story of Isabella and Richard has touched your hearts as much as it touched ours. This narrative reminds us that a person's true value is not in their external appearance, but in the richness of their spirit and the wisdom they carry within. If this story moved you, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and leave your like, as this helps us continue bringing stories that celebrate the best of humanity. Every day we bring unique narratives that explore the complexity of life and the beauty of human transformations. Tell us in the comments, have you ever witnessed situations where someone was unfairly underestimated? How can we, in our own lives, be more like Isabella, using our talents to elevate others instead of diminishing them? We await your reflections and expect you in our next content, where we will continue exploring the story